History was made today in the House of Representatives as besieged New York Congressman George Santos got the boot. The resolution, which needed a two-thirds majority vote, passed as 311 members, including 105 Republicans, voted to expel Santos. 114 members voted against, with 2 members voting present. Here's footage of how that vote went down.
On this vote, the yeas are 311, the nays are 114, with 2 recorded as present. 2/3 voting in the affirmative, the resolution is adopted, and a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. The clerk will notify the governor of the state of New York of the action of the House.
Santos is the first member of Congress to get kicked out since 2002, when Democrat James Traficant of Ohio was expelled over bribery charges. Here to join us to discuss how we got here and what happens next is Matthew Foldi, political reporter over at The Spectator, my colleague. Great to have you, Foldi, or Matthew, rather. I have to call you now.
That's right. Well, hey, it's always great to be with you, Amber.
Absolutely. So you were actually at the press conference, I believe, yesterday with now former Congressman George Santos, and he was pretty defiant, although privately it seemed like he was being honest about the fact that he did believe the votes were there to expel him from Congress. Tell us a little bit about that press conference.
So look, this was the third attempt to expel him, and in this case, the third time seemed to have been the charm. And the difference here was that in previous efforts to expel George Santos, there had not been this long-awaited for ethics report. But now the ethics report came out. You know, you've seen it, I've seen it, we've covered it at The Spectator, about how Santos's campaign is alleged to have spent money on everything from OnlyFans, which he sort of denies somewhat. He says, I only found out what OnlyFans was earlier this year, so that was a little bit strange, to Botox. And he said, look, it's no secret that I use Botox. Now that report has been out. A lot of Republicans and Democrats had been withholding judgments on voting to expel him, but for a lot of people, this proved to be the final straw. At yesterday's press conference, we did see a very defiant, somewhat fiery, somewhat funny Santos, and then later in the day, he was chatting with some reporters, and he seemed to me to be sort of resigned to the fact that this was the end for him, at least for right now. He said, look, today, as in yesterday, is my wedding anniversary, quite a memorable day. I'm going to go have dinner with my husband. We're going to go, I guess, travel this weekend. But look, I'm only 35. This isn't the end of George Santos. He talked about how he's been turning down reality TV shows. He said he, as of yesterday, was not interested in doing Dancing with the Stars. But, hey, maybe that's an option now. It worked a little bit for Sean Spicer. He said he's probably going to write a book. So I don't expect this to be the last that we'll hear from George Santos. One thing he didn't really do was address the ethics report sort of up front. He said, look, today is not the day. I will address that later, line by line. There's no indication of when that is, but now that he's no longer in Congress, he'll have a lot more free time. As for what comes next, as you heard Speaker Mike Johnson say, New York has to schedule a special election in the coming months. I think that there is, Democrats want this seat. That's one of the reasons they want Santos gone. So there's going to be all hands on deck, I think, probably from both parties. But remember that Democrats are right now trying to jettison New York's congressional map to try and basically win the House majority just with New York alone. If they win this special election, there's no guarantee that the House district that they would theoretically flip early next year is even going to be an existing district going into next November. So there's a lot of chaos, unsurprisingly, in the next iteration of the George Santos saga.
Yeah, definitely. And that Long Island seat is currently rated as a toss-up, according to most pollsters. So we'll definitely be eyeing that special election very closely. Now, the majority of Republicans did vote against the measure to expel Santos, including all of the House Republican leadership. It seems like they've had a couple of explanations for that, one of which being exactly what you mentioned, which is that the Democrats are probably supporting this measure simply because it helps them get closer to obtaining a House majority. And then others cited the potential precedent that this would set, expelling a member for things that they are merely charged with and not convicted of. They pointed out that Senator Bob Menendez, a Democrat from New Jersey, is accused of a massive bribery scam. So what do you think that they have a point, maybe, that this was maybe premature? They should have perhaps waited for the trial to play out?
So I asked Santos about the Menendez aspect yesterday, and he said that the first iteration of the charges against Menendez, right, which remember did not result in a conviction, are a good example of a member of Congress sitting, fighting the charges against him, and waiting it out. Now, this time, things are somewhat different for the Democratic senator from New Jersey, where a lot of Democrats, led by John Fetterman, actually, have been demanding that he resign. However, you're not seeing the organized push. Remember, the vote to expel George Santos was actually introduced by one of his New York, now former Republican colleagues. You're not seeing an effort to actually expel Bob Menendez from the Senate, but he pointed to that as one of the reasons why people should not necessarily rush to vote to expel him. He said, look, if we're expelling people just for charges being brought against them, that is a very dangerous road to go down. I think that's one of the, other than the raw political calculations of, losing a seat in an already very fragile Republican majority, I think that's one of the reasons that at least some of the people, 2 Democrats voted against expelling George Santos. I think of this whole thing as far as precedent setting. It reminds me of when Harry Reid blew up the filibuster and Mitch McConnell said, look, you're going to regret this because we're going to do the exact same thing when you don't like it. Look, we're seeing impeachment basically be used against whoever the president is. The next president will probably also have impeachment charges brought against them, whatever their political party is. Is this going to be the end of trying to expel members of Congress? I don't believe so. And the reason I say that is because one of the last things George Santos did while in office was introduce a resolution to expel Jamal Bowman. Now, it feels like 5 years ago. Remember, Jamal Bowman, of course, pulled the fire alarm to disrupt the proceedings of Congress, not because he's stupid, but because he's a criminal. And Santos, his measure, it will actually sort of leave office with him. But he told us yesterday that someone else will promised him to that they will carry on his torch of trying to expel Jamal Bowman. Now, the crazy thing to me is that a lot of Republicans voted to expel Santos, but I don't think that there's really any appetite to expel Jamal Bowman, even though as far as using their position for ill-gotten gains, right, like Bob Menendez, the charges are levied against him because of what he did while in office. The charges against Jamal Bowman, which he pled guilty to, are levied against him for not pulling the fire alarm while he's a middle school principal, but for pulling the fire alarm while he's a member of Congress to disrupt the proceedings of the House of Representatives. No one really is expecting Jamal Bowman to be expelled, but we'll see what happens, I guess. Maybe everyone's going to get expelled at this point.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point because Santos's alleged crimes did occur while he was running for office, not a member of Congress. But that being said, the New York colleague you were referring to, I believe, is Max Miller. He just sent an email to his GOP colleagues indicating that he was actually a personal victim of George Santos's alleged fraud, stating that he and his mother's credit card was charged for amounts above FEC limits in donations to George Santos's campaign that they did not authorize. So do you think that Max Miller's sort of personal involvement in this maybe helped him corral some of his Republican colleagues into voting against Santos and trying to expel him?
So there were 2 things going on. The New York colleague who introduced this particular resolution was Anthony D'Esposito. Max Miller, almost from he's from Ohio. He said that he sent this email this morning. Exactly right. Based on my reading of the email, it was unclear to me if those charges were during probably the 2022 campaign or after Santos won. Obviously, look, if what Max Miller is saying is true, that's horrible. No one is really saying that George Santos did nothing wrong in the run-up to his campaign. His response to that is, look, guys, I trusted a lot of the wrong people over the course of my campaign. I basically had no idea what was going on my campaign. Having run for office myself, I know it's very important that you pick a good team that you can trust with your reputation. And then he was asked if he was referring specifically to his treasurer, Nancy Marks, and he said, look, I'm not going to name names right now. But Max Miller and yesterday on the floor, had a very heated exchange. I think that Max Miller, remember, he's a Jewish Republican. He's actually Jewish. And so he was one of the first people actually on the Republican side to demand that Santos be kicked out of Congress. I think the two of them have had this sort of back and forth relationship for a very long time. And I bet that it's not like Max Miller is sending that email out to his colleagues in order to argue against expelling George Santos, right? It was actually interesting in light of how decisive the vote was to expel George Santos. There was a moment earlier today when all of House Republican leadership said that they're voting against expelling him, that the tide seemed to be sort of switching in Santos's favor. But that was for about 10 minutes. And then there were about 20 votes to spare in the, as you said, incredibly historic vote to kick out a sitting member of Congress. I mean, the people he's in the company with, like the crook from Ohio you're talking about, I mean, we're talking about former Confederate soldiers, gym traffickants, one of whose worst crimes was his hairdo, and now George Santos. This is a very small group of people in American history.
Yeah, I think one of the things complimenting adding issue to George Santos's defense here is that he was reportedly warned about the contents of the vulnerability study that was done by his team as he was running for office, and was even warned at one point that some of the issues contained therein could land him in prison. So we'll see how well that holds up, his idea of trying to blame his team members. But we're out of time. Matthew Foldi, political reporter for The Spectator, thank you so much for joining us and helping us break this down.
Always a pleasure to do it, Dan.